very brief introduction of who they are, then give about a 10-minute opening statement. Firstly, it will be Stephen, and then Trevor, and then after that there will be a bit of dialogue, and then there will be an opportunity to ask questions to both of the gentlemen. So without any further ado, so we can get maximum time, I'm going to hand you over to Stephen Latham. So thank you, Stephen.
So I guess just now I'm introducing myself.
Please do, yep.
So hello, my name is Stephen Latham. I'm the director of the Interdisciplinary Center for Bioethics at Yale University. And what that means is that I teach mostly Yale College liberal arts undergraduates about bioethics, sometimes in the philosophy department and sometimes bioethics and law in the political science department. And I'm also involved with, I chair a human subjects oversight committee that looks at research on human subjects at Yale University, and I'm involved with a number of medical research grants at the medical school at Yale as the sort of the house ethicist for a number of different labs. So that's enough about me. Trevor?
And I'm Trevor Stammers. I'm now a retired physician for about 27 years and an academic in bioethics, and I'm still the editor of the new bioethics, but I'm stepping down from that role in 3 weeks' time, and if I was still keeping it, I probably would not be revealing my cards in this way for fear that it would bias authors in either wanting or not wanting to submit.
So should we go up to the podium, or should we do this from here? I just assume do it here, if that's all right with you.
Yeah.
Would you,
yeah.
is that all right?
Yep.
All right, all right.
All right, so I'm going to start, it's always good form to start with the apologies to keep expectations down. I'm going to be kind of American about this, because I am, roughly speaking, I'm the guy who's in favor of medical aided dying, and Trevor is the guy who's against. But I'm in favor of a kind of narrowly construed American version of it, which is actually quite different from, and I think much safer than, the version of medical aid in dying that obtains in Belgium and the Netherlands, for example. So I'm going to be sort of making a case for a particular kind of assisted suicide regime. I've already used 2 different ways to talk about the topic. I will confess, I prefer the language of assisted suicide. My peers in the United States who join me in being in favor of assisted suicide would be really angry at me for having that preference. You're supposed to talk about medical aid in dying in this context. I find that language confusing, because I think good physicians aid people in dying all the time in contexts that have nothing to do with either suicide or euthanasia. And suicide and euthanasia are 2 different things, and helping people with withdrawal or withholding of end-of-life care is another thing, and it could all be encompassed in the phrase aid in dying. So I actually like the more precise language, but I've lost the political battle, and people who are in favor of what I think of as physician-assisted suicide generally want it to be referred to as medical aided dying. Now, why? Partly because they want to make the point, and this is particularly true in the American regime, that people who use medical aid
anyway, most of them don't want to be dying. They have terminal illness. The standard in the United States, we have 10 states in the US plus the District of Washington, D.C., which should be a state but isn't, but never mind. Those jurisdictions all have the standard that says that a physician can write you a prescription for a lethal medication that you take yourself. If you repeatedly ask for it, you have to have capacity, and you have to have a diagnosed terminal illness. That's the standard in all of the states in the United States where it is permitted. You take the potion yourself. It is not a matter of a physician euthanizing you, as it is, for example, in Canada, and as it certainly is in the Netherlands and Belgium. The standard is not about irremediable suffering. It's about having a terminal illness. Okay? I'll also say, I was against it before I was for it. When assisted suicide first came on the table, when Oregon started, it was originally Oregon and Washington and California all had referenda up for votes with their republics trying to pass these rules, and Oregon was the first one that passed it. At that time, I was Director of Ethics Standards at the American Medical Association, and the AMA was against it. And they were against it because they thought it was inconsistent with a physician's role to be involved in actively supplying a patient with means of death. But the real reason that I was opposed to it at the time that it was first proposed was that I thought, I agreed with many people who made the argument in the States at this time that a regime of physician-assisted suicide would be used instead of supplying good end-of-life care. It would be a cheap alternative to the kind of care and attention that it takes to really help someone through the last few months of a terminal illness. And the worry was that we were going to see particularly minority patients in the United States and perhaps less educated patients in the United States being offered suicide instead of being offered excellent end-of-life care. And I was worried about that, and the AMA at that time was worried about it. Turns out we were wrong. If you look at the statistics from Oregon, which has now got a 22-year-old assisted suicide program, and the many other states that have come aboard since then, what you find is that assisted suicide programs in the United States are used overwhelmingly, not quite, but nearly exclusively by white patients who are married, urbanites with some level of college, university education. This has not turned out to be a thing that's given to the poor instead of good care. What I like to say to my students is physician-assisted suicide is for the control freaks. The people who are used to being in charge, the well-educated white urbanites who are used to being in charge and ordering their lives according to their own agenda. And indeed, this is what we see. So here's what I like about the way we do it in the United States. The biggest single lobby against assisted suicide in the United States is the disability lobby. They come forward in all the states that are considering this, and right now I think there are 14 states in the US that are actively considering adopting assisted suicide programs, in addition to the 10 that already have. The disability lobbyists come to the legislators and they tell their shocking stories of encounters with physicians who've been only too willing to believe that because of their disabilities, their lives must be not worth living. Right? They are deeply and appropriately mistrustful of a lot of the healthcare system, and they think that a regime of assisted suicide will be used against them, and that they will be badgered or bullied or morally persuaded by family members or by insensitive and ignorant physicians to use assisted suicide when it's not appropriate. But here's the thing. If the standard in the United States were irremediable suffering, you could understand that someone with a disability might be bullied into a state of irremediable suffering. You can't be bullied into having a terminal diagnosis. And I think for that reason, because the standard in the United States is a diagnosis of terminality, that's part of what you have to have in order to gain access to these programs, this vision that people can be pushed into it has not come true. The standard also is that it's assisted suicide. You have to be able to take the medication yourself. So at the end, it really is the patient, him or herself, who's actually taking the medication. And there's no opportunity for a euthanizing physician to make assumptions about the quality of the patient's life at that last moment, and so on. So I feel like the American version of this is a little bit safer. Why do we need, yeah, thank you. Why do we need medical aid in dying? When you interview people who use these programs in the United States, what you find out is mostly they're not suffering from uncontrollable pain. Physical pain is very low on the list of things that are bothering people who use medical aid in dying programs. When you interview them, what you find out is that they feel that they've lost control of their lives aren't fun anymore, they have a terminal diagnosis, mostly it's cancer, and cancer treatment can itself be quite burdensome. They're living in a room with beeping machines in it, they're not wearing their own clothes, they feel like their relatives are just watching them suffer and die, and they want to get it over with. And for those reasons, I think it's a good option to put on the table. What do I not like about the way we do it in the United States? We don't do anywhere near as good a job of retrospective review as we should. I have friends, physicians, for example, in the Netherlands, who serve on these committees that do retrospective review of the medical records and the consents and so on for people who've used medical aid in dying programs there. In the US, there's very little retrospective examination of what went on. I'll leave it at that. I know we're going to have lots of other stuff to talk about, but I've used up my time and I'm anxious to hear what Trevor has to say.
I'm going to be very British and read it out, because otherwise I may exceed the time. Dying is something that every single one of us will certainly do, and dying well, like living well, is important. We agree on that. Whenever a colleague or friend tells me that they're in favour of the introduction of assisted dying in the UK, my usual response now is, I would imagine that you have witnessed a horrible death of someone that you care about. And they universally have to date, and so have I. And dying with unrelieved symptoms or inappropriate or futile medical interventions prolonging the dying process are still both far too common in the UK. However, part of the answer to badly managed death is a greater availability of high-quality palliative care, rather than making it legal for doctors to provide or administer lethal medication to patients to intentionally end their lives. And another part of the answer is surely caring for others. In those states which have introduced assisted dying, feeling a burden to others is one of the most frequent reasons for requesting it. And even in Oregon, in the 220 stats, which introduced assisted suicide 25 years ago, 59% of those requesting it reported concerns about being a burden as a reason for the assisted dying. And no amount of legislation can make relatives care more. Another assumption around death by the administration of lethally prescribed medications by a doctor or the prescribing of it is that the process is universally straightforward and always delivers a speedy result, a good death in inverted commas, but that is not always the case. The 2020 Oregon data, as well as indicating a 20% increase in assisted suicide compared to the previous year, showed that 3 people took 6 hours to die and 1 took over 8 hours. But the thing that struck me with the greatest force looking at the data today was that of almost a half of the 245 cases in Oregon, no other person was present at all at the time of death. And if we don't know if anyone was present, we cannot possibly know how swift or otherwise death was, or even whether the dose limiting it initially to adults who are terminally ill. However, most doctors will be aware that terminal illness can be incredibly difficult to predict. My own father was given a terminal prognosis 15 years before he died, and during that time we travelled the world together. Also, in US states where assisted dying is legal, an illness may become terminal not because you could not survive longer or even be cured by appropriate treatment, but because your insurance company may decide that assisted dying is a cheaper option than treatment, and therefore inform you, as they did in a letter to one Barbara Wagner, that they will pay for assisted dying, but not for your treatment, thereby surely essentially pressuring you towards assisted dying. The US National Disability Council, in its report, The Danger of Assisted Suicide Laws, reported that insurers have denied patients expensive life-sustaining treatment, but offered lethal drugs, leading patients to hasten their own death. Now, of course, in the UK, treatment is free at the point of need, and no democratic government would surely even think about introducing assisted dying on economic grounds alone. But those that have introduced it, such as Canada, have been very open about the savings on healthcare that it does bring with it. And then when an initial bill for assisted dying is proposed, there are always promised safeguards, which are then, certainly in Europe, over time removed. The restriction to terminally ill adults is actually usually the first to go. It becomes extended to children, in Belgium within 12 years, and in Canada within a mere 5 years if they introduce it next year. And the other inevitable extension in Europe certainly seems to be from the terminally ill to those with chronic physical illness and those with unbearable suffering. And it's that last one that I find the most troubling, because once you concede that those with physical illness with unbearable suffering can access assisted dying, either politicians themselves or court action from patients will rightly insist that the unbearable suffering of those with psychiatric illness should also qualify for assisted dying. And this causes me great concern, because Canada only introduced assisted dying by either assisted suicide or euthanasia in 2015. And next March, those with psychiatric illness will become eligible. In 2021, over 10,000 people had their lives ended by medical aid in dying, MAID as they call it. Once the gates are open to those with mental illness in March, psychiatrists will inevitably find themselves having to offer assisted suicide as a treatment option for suicidal patients. And if you doubt me, have a look at the website of the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto, one of Canada's most prestigious mental hospitals. The question and answer page on their website about MAID I find repulsive. The questions include, can people with mental illness access MAID? What happens if somebody wants MAID because they can't get the mental health care that they need? Even to see the questions is disturbing. Some of the answers are even more disturbing. But Canada has, however, shown the world how quickly MAID becomes vulnerable to incremental extension once you make it legal for doctors to provide or administer lethal medication to patients. And in recent weeks, there's been a raft of global press coverage expressing concern about what is happening there. A New York Times reporter 3 days ago wrote this: "It is not barbaric for the law to acknowledge hard choices in end-of-life care about when to withdraw life support or how aggressively to manage agonizing pain. But it is barbaric, however, to establish a bureaucratic system that offers death as a reliable treatment for suffering and enlists the healing profession in delivering this cure." And he touches here on my final concern, and that is the intrinsic danger of the necessity of teaching doctors to end their patients' lives and how to do it efficiently. That you have to do, I suggest, even with assisted suicide, for if the administered dose does not for whatever reason work, and sometimes it doesn't, presumably that patient is not going to be revived. And what happens to those patients who cannot administer it themselves, or even swallow. The process of assisted suicide alters the fundamental core principle of medicine, it seems to me, of doing no harm. As the New York Times article concluded, the evil isn't just in the interactions, it's right there in the foundation. The idea that human rights encompass a right to self-destruction. The same conceit that people in a state of terrible suffering and vulnerability are really free to make a choice that ends all choices. The idea that a healing profession should include death in its battery of treatments. These are inherently destructive ideas, close quote. They certainly are. And once you open that door and legalize it, it lets those forces in, and you will not be able to shut that door again.
Thank you very much, both of you, for those introductory remarks. I think you've laid out, the sides really quite helpfully. We're going to move now into a time where our two panelists are going to dialogue together. I think that probably means we ask each other questions, but dialogue sounds more formal. So, and I understand we're going to do this in a way that Stephen is going to pose some questions to Trevor, and then Trevor maybe pose some questions to Stephen, and then once that happens, we'll then an opportunity for the rest of us to pose questions to both of them. So, can I hand it back to you, Trevor, and say, have you any particular questions or points or dialogue you want to pick up at this point?
Yeah, and I think that I'd like to focus on probing you a bit about Oregon, because I've not focused on that, but I did read today through the data for 2020, and I have to say that I don't share your sanguine view that all is necessarily rosy there. So I'd like to sort of probe you a little bit about that. Perhaps we could just start on the issue of the white, well-educated people. Surely this describes something more going on than just terminally ill people receiving assisted suicide, because there must be ethnic minorities with terminal illness, and there were absolutely no black Americans in Oregon who received it. So
yeah, that's right, and that's a very interesting thing that's happened, because as I said, when the programs were first sort of introduced, the fear was that this was going to be offered instead of good end-of-life care to less well-educated and poorer and minority patients. And now the debate has turned around to where people are saying, there seems to be an access problem here. How come there aren't more poor and minority and black patients using this program? And people are starting to say, well, maybe what we're seeing here is a failure to communicate all of the options, or a failure of physicians to listen to their patients, or maybe there's some sort of, if I had to make a guess, and I'm reluctant to make it because it is a guess, but I would say that we have a very well justified mistrust, particularly in the African American community in the United States, of the healthcare system, due to things that we could name like Tuskegee, but also due to ongoing healthcare inequities that occur along racial lines, right? I'm on an ethics committee at Yale New Haven Hospital, and very frequently the structure of the kinds of disagreements we have between families and the medical team is the medical team says, it's probably time to stop doing this really aggressive care for your loved one. We should be controlling their symptoms and allowing them to go peacefully. And the family doesn't believe that the medical team has their interests in mind, and they think their job is to hold the medical team's feet to the fire and say, no, I'm not leaving here until you say you're doing everything for my mother, right? Well, I feel like that's showing up in the assisted suicide numbers, where the minority population is not going to come forward and say, yeah, time to end this. No, they don't think the system is working for them, and they're pressing for every possible intervention. Now, I feel like that needs fixing, but it's going to be a long and very difficult process of conversation and community representative work and so on.
I'm sure that lack of trust and access may play a part, because certainly it's more difficult. You have a longer wait for an organ transplant if you're in a minority group in the States. But I wonder if it may also be something to do with what you said about control freaks. And I think this affects worldviews and the dominance of individual autonomy, that I am the captain of my soul. Maybe those families also in Hispanics and other networks actually care for one another more, and less people in those families do feel that they're a burden on others, because they are surrounded by a loving family that affirms them rather than living at a distance.
That may be true. I'm not led from there to think that therefore these patients whose families are not surrounding them with love and supporting them should be condemned to an extra 6 months of slow death under cancer therapy if they could instead commit suicide, if they prefer that, right? Part of my response to a lot of what you said is slippery slope arguments. And at least several of them don't seem to have occurred in the United States. The ones you mentioned in connection with Canada have occurred. But only in a certain world is it true that the fact that a program is used more and more each year, and that people who don't have access to it are trying to get access to it. Only in some places does that count as an argument against it.
It's the half that have no witness that worry me, because you don't know what's going on there. You don't know that the dose has been administered voluntarily, and this is, hundreds of people each year. And one of the things that I mentioned to you, that at House of Lords debate, somebody said that feeling a burden is not necessarily, it's something to take into the equation. But of course, in those states that don't have assisted suicide, in elder care, that is often a signal of elder abuse. But in those states that do have it, it's a tick box for going ahead with this. And the person said in the House of Lords, it's easy to spot the abusers. Well, that just speaks out of the fullness of her ignorance, because if they were easy to spot, we would have less of it. And my experience as a GP is that both child abusers and elder abusers are the most devious and difficult people to spot. And I have been fooled completely by several of them. You cannot know, can you? And in Oregon, it's a genuine question. It seems to me nobody's asking the question if half of them are dying with nobody else present. Well, seemingly, because they're dead, so they can't give any witness at all.
Yeah, so there's a lot of question about what you mean exactly by nobody else present. Because, for example, Oregon, because Oregon was the first mover on this, Compassion and Choices, which is a big sort of pro-MAID lobby organization, had set up a bunch of kind of assistant people on the ground to work with families to help them use the program. And they are often right there with the families.
But they're in the half where there is a witness. In a third of cases, doctors are present. The other making up the half is these end-of-life folk. But the others, no one according to the report.
No one is where? In the room where the patient takes the medication at the moment they take the medication? Because
that's
a frequent
that's
pattern,
correct.
a frequent pattern is everybody comes over to the house, you say goodbye to all your friends and relations. It's a tearful thing. And then, of course, your family doesn't want to sit there and watch you actually take the potion. So you go off into the room, into a bedroom, in a different room by yourself, and take it by yourself, because to be eligible, you have to take it by yourself. These are not euthanasia rules. These are assisted suicide rules. And you take it in a room alone, and 10 minutes later, the relatives come in and look, and they discover that indeed you've died. But they don't want to actually be there, and perhaps for privacy reasons, you don't want them to be there while you consume the pill.
Yeah,
so I'm a little worried that the data you're citing include that sort of thing, which I find benign.
Could be so, but part of the reason that they raise this in the data is that in that half of the patients, they cannot know whether there have been complications, whether the patient has had seizures or whatever. And so there is a big gap where I think, it may not be as benign as...
Yeah, so this is a place where, as long as the standard were terminality, consent, full capacity, I might actually be open to euthanasia in addition to assisted suicide. For example, when Canada first introduced their program, they allowed for both, and everyone chose euthanasia. And I think the reason is that if you're doing assisted suicide, sort of taking the potion yourself, people vomit it up.
Yeah.
People can't swallow the whole thing before they pass out, and so it takes them hours to die, and so on.
Yeah.
So there's a sense in which the whole thing can be a bit cleaner if a physician with some expertise can help you. On the other hand, that does raise possibilities of a bad actor, possibilities of a physician who's not willing to recognize a last-minute change of heart, and those kinds of things. So, I'm a little troubled about that. I want to ask you about one thing, though. The idea that death is not part of the ordinary arsenal of the attending physician, and that it's somehow a terrible thing if we involve physicians in the administration of death, seems to me to depend on lots of very subtle arguments about doing and allowing and so on, right? Because physicians, for example, if I want to have my feeding tube removed, the physician doesn't come along and unplug the thing from me, or if that's the first thing that happens, the physician is then going to put glycerin on my lips, might give me a chip of ice to prevent thirst, because what's going to kill me is the lack of fluid. My kidneys are going to shut down, but the physician is going to be observing and helping me through all of that, right? Physicians are, and we could talk about terminal sedation in some kinds of contexts, right? Physicians, particularly in certain kinds of specialties, are intimately involved with the facilitation of death. And I think the idea that somehow that they should write a prescription gets them in a much more sort of terrifying position about the ends of their medical practice than does having them be involved in withholding and withdrawal of life support and offering people medication that sedates them until the point where their respiration is depressed. I think that's more an emotional argument than a proper kind of role morality argument.
I see where you're coming from, and to some extent I have sympathy with it. But that rather forcibly written diatribe was the New York reporting. That wasn't me. But I can see where he comes from, and I think you can see where it's coming from in regard to Canada, which is a slightly different thing. But interestingly, because I agree with you that, I mean, all of us are in the process of dying, and doctors see people when they are in conditions where sometimes treatment does become futile, and often the accusation is made that that equates to euthanasia. But I don't think the public see it like that. And I actually coming up on the train, a total stranger said, "Are you going up for work?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Oh," he said, "that's interesting because my mother is in hospital, and she's not eating, she's not drinking, she's blind. She has no quality of life, and I've just signed, that we agree that that treatment can be withdrawn. Now, it's interesting that he introduced that story in a debate that is dealing with assisted dying, and I think the public perception often does confuse the two. But I then said to him, how would you feel if the doctor instead gave a lethal prescription so that she could take it or administer it to her? And you know, that I could see in his eyes was a different thing. So I think as bioethicists, as doctors who are looking at these things all the time, we look at the actions and say, are they any different? But I think the intent is very different. Can I just share with you a personal anecdote
Sure.
about this? Because I've written about this in The Spectator when the last bill came up in Parliament, and I entitled it Lethal Temptation. And the essence of the story is that in the days when we as GPs did night visits, I was called out about 2 a.m. to see a patient that I didn't know, one of my partners, I was in a big practice, who had an abdominal cancer. And he was in a state of existential angst, and understandably so. And he said to me, you know, would you be willing to kill me? And I was so tired, so actually probably at that point fed up with doing the job that I've said in public before. For 2 pins, if the law had allowed me to do it, I might have done it, and it would have nothing to do with compassion or care or whatever. And we did speak over dinner about in Oregon there being some physicians who won't do it at all, but there are some who specialize in it. And it concerns me that Belgian doctors certainly have written about how the first one is very difficult, but then the second one's not quite so bad, and it's something that you can get used to. I feel uneasy about physicians in that place, and I would feel very uneasy about being in that place because doctors are so good at killing. As you say, we deal with death a lot, and that's what we do.
Yeah, I guess I'm just going to step back and make a very huge kind of general point. There are lots of places that a legal regime of medical aid in dying could go. There are lots of things you could imagine could go wrong. One of them is that you could get a subset of physicians for whom this becomes routine and indeed becomes their bread and butter.
Yeah.
Less true in a place with the National Health Service, right, where bread and butter doesn't mean exactly what it means in the States, right? But you could worry about that. You could worry about other kinds of slippery slope problems. But those are, I don't know, I'm not a good enough mathematician, but there's like type 1 and type 2 error, right? Let's say those are the type 2 error. The type 1 error is the hundreds of people who are having miserable deaths right now that are not hypothetical, that are not going to happen at some time in the future, maybe, that we might accidentally slip toward. That's happening now. And the things that we might accidentally slip toward, we can also try to legislate against. So I guess my fundamental feeling is that there's more of an urgent need for those people who are dying very unhappy deaths to have access to an option like this. I'm more worried about that, which is a concrete thing that's happening now, than I am about where a regime might start to go if we got too used to it. Not least because if those things start to happen, we can try to fix them.
you can try, certainly. It's just a question of, is there not another way to solve this problem of these agonizing deaths? And are they agonizing because of psychological factors, or are they agonizing because of pharmacological factors? And if not, why can't the pharmacology, what I'm saying is that I think that there is a tension, obviously, because we're having this dialogue between palliative care that seeks for symptom control, and I'm all for assisted dying for that. I want assistance if I'm in pain or vomiting or, whatever. But being given an option to self-destruct by a physician seems to indicate to me that that is something that the society that does that would want. And if my dad had been given that option and he'd taken it, I mean, obviously we've had those 15 precious years. I wonder how many lives have been foreshortened. Well, we know that one guy in Oregon took the prescription 4.5 years after he'd been. So again, it shows how difficult it can be. I can see that there are problems in Oregon that I would hope could be sorted in another way without resorting to the prescribing of lethal medication in that way.
I'm going to leave that hanging, if that's okay with both of you, because we're going to move on, because I am conscious that we are keen to finish on time and we are keen to hear questions from the floor. I have the chair's prerogative. I can ask the first 3 questions, so I'm also going to take that, and then I'm going to hand over to you, so do get asking the questions. I'm going to ask a question to each of you, and then a question for both of you, and I'm going to start with you, Trevor, if that's okay. You seem to, when you were talking, almost go against individual choice, right? It seemed to be a bad thing, to give a person an individual choice to decide how they want to live their life. You seem to see that as a negative rather than a positive. Are we at a place where society thinks, actually, it is my life, I get to choose what job I do, I get to choose where I marry, I get to choose a lot of these things. Why are you taking away that ultimate choice of when I bring my life to an end?
Well, it seems to me that we already have a choice under the law in this country, and that is suicide. And I have a friend who has told me that she has a cupboard full of pills, which when the time comes when she considers that her quality of life is so poor, she is going to take them and end her life. And I don't agree with her over that, but I think that the fact that so many of the people that I meet who are in favour of assisted dying, present company accepted, I may say, seem to have an almost religious veneration of personal autonomy, that almost the choice becomes supreme, and I have it in every other area, so I must have it in this. But it's not a choice to take my own life. It is a choice to force the medical profession to change its outlook on this, to be able to, as it were, give the blessing to the gaining of those pills instead of going to do it myself. So it's not that I oppose choice, and I think it's another story concerning my father when he was dying was that his choices were not respected, and he had made it clear that in that terminal phase he did not want to have curative treatment. And 5 days before he died, I'd made this clear, he'd made it clear, to the ward staff. I went in and I found out they'd put up a drip of intravenous antibiotics because he'd got a urinary tract infection. And I said, why have you done this? And the ward sister said, well, you know what young doctors are like. We've got a new one on this week. And he felt that we've got to do something. And it's this lack of, you know, staff who know when to stop. And I insisted that they move Dad into a hospice, which then happened. So I'm all for choices that will help to ease people dying, but not encourage them to do it and not force doctors to be in a position where they are directly responsible for providing the means for it.
Okay, thank you. Stephen, I've been turning to you. I was interested, and I say this as someone who has had a bit of a bad experience around terminal definitions, because terminal illness is broadly defined within UK law as about 6 months.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's the same for US
Yes.
as well.
Yeah.
But as we know, I was talking to a doctor recently who gave somebody a terminal illness diagnosis as a GP. They went off and sold everything they had, went on one more cruise, and 15 years later was still happily alive.
Sure.
So we all know that terminal illness is not a definite, and you know, arguably philosophically we are all terminally ill. So how do we safeguard against the person that gets the diagnosis, but actually medically it's just not right?
Yeah, so that is a real problem. It's a good example of this is that in the United States under Medicare, which is our national health insurance for the elderly, you're not eligible for hospice care unless you get a terminal diagnosis. But we have quite a few patients who stay in hospice for 16 or 18 months before they die, which means they got a terminal diagnosis and they didn't die in the expected 6 months. And that's especially common with very elderly people with cancers, because it turns out their metabolic rates are so slow that the cancers take a very surprisingly long time to advance. So is it imperfect? Yes, it is. The kinds of cases that you've both mentioned, the sort of the 15 years of worth of imperfect, those things are quite incredibly rare. And the thing that I am singing the virtues of when I say I prefer access to assisted suicide to be only for people with a terminal illness, what I'm comparing it to is regimes where access to assisted suicide is triggered by something a lot less well-defined, like irremediable suffering, which is the standard in European countries. In Canada, they chose a statutory formulation that no one understood from day one, which is they say you don't require a terminal illness, but the death has to be foreseeable in the reasonable future. There may be someone here who remembers the exact statutory language, but it's sort of kind of halfway between a terminal diagnosis and not. And I find that very confusing. It just seems to me that having the threshold be a terminal diagnosis, however imperfect that might be, does eliminate a lot of the dangers of psychological pressuring and so on that you worry about in regimes where there is not that kind of line.
Okay, again, I think that's helpful. My question to both of you, I was very interested, and I hadn't actually picked up that in regard to the USA, that there hasn't been a major change in the law once it comes in. So as you say, within Canada, within other Western European countries, we've seen a redefinition really quite quickly in regard to definitions. I'm just wondering, why do you think that is? I mean, maybe to both of you, is that something set up within the US legal system mindset, or why has that not happened as it's happened in other parts of the world?
I'm not sure why it hasn't happened. I think it is to the good that it hasn't. And actually, I would agree with Stephen that as well as some of the individual stories of things going very badly wrong, which they can do in a system that doesn't have assisted dying, that I think it's well into the 80% of folks have cancer who receive the lethal prescription. But some of the other diagnoses I find counter what you're saying. I mean, diabetes was a fairly common one. Now of course, insulin-dependent diabetes patients are terminally ill if they stop their insulin and so on. So, and arthritis, I think, was another if you look down the list. So nothing is 100% perfect, and 87 or whatever it is, that's surprisingly good. But there is some fallout around the margins, I think, that doesn't make me think that some of those ought to be looked into as to why they were given the prescription.
Yeah, so I don't know enough, frankly, about medicine to understand which diabetic would be given a terminal diagnosis by a physician. And I don't understand what kind of arthritic condition should be classified as a terminal arthritic condition. I'm guessing it would be rather bad. So I don't know the answer to that question. I will want to say it's not all the laws in the states are the same as one another. One thing, for example, is that when California decided to pass this, they did two things that I think you would approve of. One is that they gave institutions the ability to opt out of the program. So, for example, the Catholic-run hospitals in California, it's about 15% of all American hospitals are Catholic-run. And Catholic-run hospitals are allowed not to offer assisted suicide at their facilities. Even if there are physicians there willing to offer it, they could say, no, not here. And that means that a patient who wants assisted suicide needs to be transferred somewhere else. So that's one thing that California did that other states haven't done. The other thing is they have very explicit language about insurance and about not allowing insurance companies to incentivize suicide. And California did that because there were some complaints about things like this that had happened in Oregon. And this is an example, I think, of if you're worried about that slippery slope, guess what? You can legislate against it and at least try to stop it. Why hasn't it changed? I think because in litigious America, there has not yet been a really successful big damages case brought under the Oregon Assisted Suicide Statute. And that counts as proof for legislators all around the United States that it's a stable system. I think that's really the answer.
Thank you. Thank you for answering my questions. Well, it's now over to you. We have a slight standing joke within the Scottish Parliament that the presiding officer, the Speaker, always says, I want short questions and I want short answers. And it never happens. But I am going to ask for that because we have got about half an hour left, but there's quite a number of people here. So if you can keep your question reasonably short, and if I can ask the panel, you two gentlemen, if you can keep your answers reasonably distinct as well. You don't have to introduce yourself if you don't want. There are mics, or there's one mic at least. I saw one of my colleagues, John Mason, one of the Glasgow MSPs, looking his hand up. So I'm going to give it to John, and then if you want to ask a question, if you can just stick your hand up, I will try to come to you after that. So John is in the row over here with a kind of...
Yeah. I'll just quickly remind those watching, you can go to slido.com. I typed in the comment as well. I'll type in the code Trinity. You can send me questions that way as well.
Thanks very much. So John Mason, MSP for East End of Glasgow. It was on the point, actually, just was touched on right at the end, the financial side. I'm an accountant by background, so I am interested in the financial side. And one of my concerns would be that, certainly for the NHS, which is always under budget pressure, it would be positive financially for somebody to end their life more quickly and more expensive. And the reference was made by Trevor, I think, that that was the case with some insurance companies in America, that they were in many ways encouraging assisted suicide. But from what was just said right at the end from Stephen, I think at least California seems to have cut around that. But just this, do you not think there would be financial pressure if we did it here?
So this actually allows me to address something that Trevor said earlier as well. One of the things that we worried about back when I was at the AMA and Oregon was first adopting these rules, we thought they're going to give everybody assisted suicide and they're never going to get good at hospice. They're never going to start getting palliative care in their hospitals. Right, assisted suicide will be the cheap option, and state Medicaid programs will opt for that and will not develop these other things. Exactly the opposite has happened. And I heard it actually from an Oregon physician. He said, you know, you really don't want your patient to say to you, can you help me with this assisted suicide program because I'd rather die than continue under your care, right? Most physicians don't want that, and the result has been that in the states that do have assisted suicide programs, their hospice and their palliative care programs and their home hospice programs have expanded. The availability of assisted suicide has made the availability of more palatable options for a lot of the physicians more urgent. And that's a long way of saying, I think assisted suicide saves money on a patient who uses it. But it's not clear to me that it saves money system-wide, because I think it creates pressures to expand better and more capacious systems of end-of-life care in the rest of the field. That's my guess.
I'm afraid, John, I'm not an economist at all, and my wife does all the family budgeting because my looking after it is not great. So this is a question that I think is debatable. Certainly there is in the academic papers one from Canada where they are looking at global savings which are substantial, but I have no reason to doubt Stephen's comment that in America that has been very different. I think it must be very difficult working within the British hospice system to have the option of assisted suicide running in parallel, and the majority of I think geriatricians and hospice doctors in the UK are far more opposed to it than, you know, the overall. So I think there would be human difficulties with workforce and divided loyalties among staff. Of course, the truth is that when the law changes and doctors are permitted to end patients' lives or help them to end their own lives, that you then face the choice of, you know, do I leave the profession or do I knuckle under? I'm sure that some will leave, but others will replace them, and the system will continue. I don't think it'll break down.
I'm not aware of anywhere that forces any particular physician to participate in an assisted suicide or euthanasia program. Like what I said in Oregon, the physicians who don't want to do it, they have to refer their patients to other physicians who are willing.
Yes.
But no particular physician is forced to resign or kill someone.
I think that I would have to, if I were in that position, I would have to resign because I did not want to be identified in working with a place that was known to have two exits, as it were. And I cannot be alone in that. It's a difference, I think, between being, you know, feeling that you're compelled to do it and knowing that you may not be compelled to do it, but you cannot in all conscience work within it. And Canada has certainly passed some draconian laws to ensure that doctors are not allowed to exercise conscientious objection. And the judge who gave the ruling, I think, used the extraordinary phrase that it's because people were in such a vulnerable position that, you know, they could not allow doctors to not offer them death. I mean, I just looked at that judgment and I thought, what have we come to? But that's not Oregon.
Okay, I'm going to stop there. I'm going to go to the very, very back, just to another person with the mic. And then we'll come forward one to the chap with the kind of goatee beard, and then we'll come forward more to those. We'll go to the back and then walk way back.
Thank you, Jeremy. My name is John Stirling. I'm a lawyer, but primarily a litigator. Actually, in that context, that I wanted to ask a question. So much of this discussion, this topic, like so many others in our world today, is treated in a binary way. So we have yes, no, right, wrong, my side, your side. And that seems to be an adequate way to deal with what are very complex issues. And as your dialogue has shown tonight, and thank you very much for the way you conducted it, there's much more nuance, much more complexity, much more uncertainty in this issue. Against that background, and the fact that it seems to me there's quite a lot of common ground between you, in fact a lot of common ground between you, do you think that given time, you could together propose a mutually acceptable approach to this issue which would satisfy both of your concerns?
I don't think so.
Say more, Stephen.
No, I think at the end we do have a core disagreement about whether physicians and the entire healthcare system should be involved in deliberately speeding someone toward death. I think that's fine, and I think it's consistent with values that I see at play in medical practice all the time, and I think Trevor really disagrees with me about that, right?
I don't think I do, because clearly with withdrawal of treatment, you're speeding someone towards death. Mm-hmm. And there are certain types of, well, you may or may not, I mean, you probably know when, you know, morphine is given, sometimes patients live longer than they would have done without it, and so on. But I mean, that aside, I think there are situations in which it is right that a patient's death should not be prolonged, and that could be considered to be, you know, speeding it up, that we could make it longer. I think it's more to do with the issue of providing them with the means to end their own life. That to me is a different thing. And I just cannot reconcile that with the life in medicine that I have lived in fear for young doctors who will be charged with that responsibility as well. And I think you're right, though, that we probably couldn't agree on something tonight. But I'm not quite sure that what you've said is the dividing line.
Right. Yeah, I see that point. But there are lots of things that we agree on. There are lots of the same kinds of places where we're both hesitant, and there are a lot of the same kinds of things that we're worried about. But I think in the end, there's a practice that I would approve of that Trevor would not approve of. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you just want to come forward, couple to the chat there, yeah.
Hi. Yeah, I mean, I have so many thoughts and questions, and quite frankly, almost wish that I could have been on the panel to just take part the entire time. But I'll try and keep it brief. A lot of the focus has been on the medical element of assisted suicide, and I don't know if there's a reason for that I'm not aware of. I've been kind of trying to find clues that maybe it's like the medical society or something or other, and I haven't seen any. But there was in the news recently something about a man who, I don't know if it was in Canada or somewhere, but he was essentially saying that he would rather die than be homeless. And that's just an example. He isn't the focus of my question, but I'm just wondering suppose I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the elements of assisted suicide and euthanasia that aren't necessarily connected to medical conditions, to health, and yeah, I think that broadly covers what I'm asking. Thanks.
Well, I have a feeling that we do both agree on, because one of my biggest concerns is the drift from physical illness, and particularly terminal illness as well as we can discern it, and the shift into psychiatric illness, which I would see as, you know, once you start conceding unbearable suffering, then there can be no divide. And that example of the homeless man, he said, I don't want to die, but I don't want to be homeless more than I don't want to die. And I would guess that both of us would feel that Canada's in a mess, really.
Yeah. Yeah, and based on your earlier comment about your friend who has some pills in her cupboard, we also both think that there is such a thing as rational suicide outside of the medical context, right? Yeah. So then, if we really wanted to work our way through all the various kinds of reasons for suicidality and try to address which social institutions ought to be mobilized to address them and which kinds of suicide ought to just be left alone, that would be a very long discussion. But I think what's unique about the medical aid in dying discussion, really, is that a big reason why terminally ill patients want to commit suicide is that medicine became so really terrific after the war, in the first sort of 15, 20 years after World War II, that it became so good that it could be burdensome. And there are ways of dying, and cancer patients experience them a lot, that are really medically burdensome. And the burden is not just with the potions they give you. It's not just the chemotherapy or the drugs or whatever it might be. It's the institutional atmosphere. It's the way in which patients are cared for. All of those things contribute, I think, to making some patients' desire for suicide in that context rational. Is the desire for suicide of the homeless person rational? Possibly. Should we address it by allowing him to commit suicide, or should we address it by figuring out something different to do about homelessness? Those are the kinds of questions we'd have to address if we're really going to follow your question all the way down.
Well, we're going to go online for a moment.
Yeah, I'll ask a pair of two, because I think at least one can be answered quickly. How widespread is the situation of health insurers saying that they will pay for end-of-life intervention but not ongoing care or treatment? So that's one. Second one is, how does the panel feel about recent events in Canada with the fashion retailer made an advert featuring a person who was pursuing MAID? So I don't know if you want to take either of those if you're really trying to answer.
I can't answer the second one. I'm not familiar with the advert. I don't know what this is.
Tackle that.
Okay. Insurance companies are forced by the states in which assisted suicide is legal to cover it, right? So they're supposed to pay for the prescription pills if they have insureds, because assisted suicide done according to the legal standards put in the state law is a legal part of medical practice. And if it's a medically necessary procedure in the view of a doctor and under the law, then the insurance company is supposed to cover it. The real question is, how often do insurance companies say, I won't pay for your end-of-life care, I have to pay for your suicide if that's the option you pick? How often do they cynically dive in and try to not pay for expensive end-of-life care in order to induce suicidality? I think those cases are rare, which is why they get a great deal of press coverage when they occur. And as I say, I think California legislated very deliberately to get rid of it, and I expect other states to do so as well.
Okay, I'm going to come down. I think Zoe had her hand up.
Oh, could I
Well,
answer?
we still got the-
we've got the one
Canadian
about the
advert.
advert.
Yeah.
Yes, there have been several global press articles about this advert. It's a clothing manufacturer that's one of Canada's best known, but I won't mention its name because I think they're trying to jump on the bandwagon to advertise your clothing products by featuring a woman with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. I had a patient with Ehlers-Danlos, and it's a grim condition, but it's not a terminal condition. But she was a British Columbia woman who wanted made in Canada, and the pitch of this film has an ethereal sort of religious, spiritual, it's about 3.5 minutes long, it's beautifully shot, it cost them a lot of money, and it's very badly backfired on them, and I read in the press yesterday they've removed it from their website, but I guess we both have concerns about in fact, a palliative care colleague said to me yesterday that we don't refer on our site to MAID, we call it MAD. And I think that advert is a good example of how it's slipped over in Canada to something that is extremely bizarre. And I hope that the financial implications, presumably they've had in withdrawing the advert, will not encourage any more of it.
Hi. In the sector of assisted suicide, is there a distinction that's made between a treatment that directly kills you as intent and the use of painkillers to as much painkillers as needed to stop the pain, even if it kills you as a byproduct, if that makes sense? Is there a distinction made between those, and is that something that would sort of change your perspective? Because I quite see that if someone is in absolutely excruciating agony and they're desperate for pain relief, then that would, and the kind of view is, oh, but if we give you this much pain relief, that it will end your life, but the person thinking, but I must have the relief, I just can't go on. And do they make a distinction between that and a fatal pill as such?
I think the literature medically is really, really clear on this. And the Sobel House Hospice in Oxford, there was a palliative care consultant there called Robert Twycross, who's a world leader in the use of morphine. And sometimes the other side here would say, well, you're bumping people off anyway by giving them, that is not true. It is true that the lethal cocktail that's given, the 3 lethal cocktails now in Oregon, does contain morphine as the primary lethal substance, but giving incremental doses to control a patient's pain. There have been lots of studies showing that it does not shorten life, and in some cases it may lengthen it, but these are complex studies to do.
Yeah, I think there's no jurisdiction in the United States where it would be illegal to risk a patient's death if what you're aiming at is the pain control. There's the doctrine of double effect is often invoked in this connection. And there's also a practice called palliative sedation, which is done in pretty extreme cases where patients are suffering a lot at the end of life, sometimes because they're suffering with tremendous anxiety. Some people, when they are dying, are very anxious about that fact and are unable to sleep, for example, without being sedated into a state of unconsciousness. And if you keep people sedated for too long, it messes up their circulatory systems, and it can eventually cause death. Palliative sedation is used in a lot of hospices all the time. The point is that it is chasing after symptom control, not aiming at causing the death. You're not killing the person to end their suffering. You're trying to end their suffering at risk of killing them. And there's no jurisdiction where those things are illegal.
The lady at the back, yes, with her hand up, and then we'll come across to the other side in a moment.
Hi. So let's say hypothetically we've got a terminally ill patient and we give them the right to die. What would we do if we had a paranoid schizophrenic patient or someone with another mental difficulty? How do we determine that they are sound of mind to make the decision of finality? Furthermore, how do we advocate for a person facing mental difficulty if they do develop a disease like cancer? How do we enforce a named person who can support them in their decision? How do we factor human rights, free will and equal rights into supporting people humanely in their journey into the inevitable?
Okay, I think there's probably 20 questions, which is quite impressive in 30 seconds. That was very impressive. But I am going to ask you, because we are down to the last 10 minutes, 1 minute. I know it's difficult, but can we give a 1 minute, 2 minute answer maximum each to those questions, please?
In the US, in the 10 states, the 10 jurisdictions, 9 states and the DC, that permit assisted suicide, you have to have capacity at the time that you take the potion. And what this means is that assisted suicide is commonly not available to patients, for example, with Alzheimer's, because by the time they're within 6 months of death, they've lost capacity. Similarly, with ALS patients, by the time they're within 6 months of death, they've lost the ability to take the potion on their own. And so ALS patients can say no to certain kinds of care. They can have a feeding tube withdrawn or whatever. So there are groups who are agitating for access to assisted suicide for people who lose capacity over time. For reasons that would take a long time to get into, I'm opposed to that. Because demented patients may well forget that they would not have wanted to live like this by the time they are living like that. And to impose a duty on physicians and other caregivers to help them to commit suicide when they've forgotten their desire to do so seems to me really troubling.
Yes, I would certainly agree with that. And there was the horrendous case in Belgium, for which the doctor was exonerated, where the demented lady who'd given her advance directives to say she wanted euthanasia was shouting out, "Don't kill me, don't kill me," so he had the relatives hold her down while he injected her. We will be spared that in an Oregon system. But again, your question reminds me of something else about the Oregon data. There was a study done by a psychiatrist, I think called Linda Glassner or something like that, showing that understandably about a third of terminally ill patients with cancer do develop depression. And I think under the legislation, competency and, if necessary, a psychiatric evaluation needs to be carried out. Now, if a third may have depression, out of the 245 who died in the 2020 data, only 3 had a psychiatric assessment, and that seems to me something that really does need sorting out. Yeah, enough said about that.
Thank you. I'm going to come round here. There's Gordon and then Shona. Do you want to ask your question online while you're walking?
Yeah, so we'll do that. I think we've picked up polls about stipulations around capacity with dementia. I don't know if this is for Jeremy, but it says in the UK politicians often say trust the doc, or we trust the doctors. As a GP of 40 myself, I find this astonishing. It's more common than a question, I guess.
I got voted as a GP. I totally agree with that comment. Never trust the doctor.
The problem with legalizing assisted suicide is it forces vulnerable people to make a choice. So there's a few comments. I'll read one more. The BMA poll showed only 26% would be prepared to be involved in assisted death. So highlight the need for conscientious objections. There's just a few comments if you want to comment on those.
Jeremy, my question basically related to Trevor's last point, actually, and it was specifically for Stephen. You know, if we're talking about minimum probably 25% of people with a terminal illness having clinical depression, according to Annette Hansen, who's a Canadian psychiatrist, or possibly up to 80% if it's the American Psychiatric Association's estimate, it's not a huge issue there, particularly in Oregon, with people not getting psychiatric evaluation. It's only 1%. You know, why is that? And you know, how can people be sure that clinical depression is not driving this rather than the physical illness? And particularly if the clinical depression is treatable, then clearly the person might change their mind. And then the other point, really, very quickly, people say that there's a federal law in America which doesn't allow euthanasia. I don't know whether that's true or not true, but I just wonder, Stephen, whether there is any truth in that.
That doesn't allow
Euthanasia, but obviously assisted suicide is allowed. I've never been able to track that down, so I'm just wondering if that might be the reason why we've never seen euthanasia laws in America rather than assisted suicide laws. But if that's not the case, I still don't understand why there's such a limitation in America, which isn't the case in lots of other jurisdictions.
So the latter thing first. The prescribing power is federal in the United States. So physicians' ability to prescribe medications is a federal thing. The contours of the practice of medicine and whether those contours include something like medical aid in dying are for state law. I'm not aware of a federal law that specifically says no euthanasia, but I'm pretty confident that there is no drug approved for euthanasia by the federal government. And so even if a state passed a euthanasia regime, the federal government would have to act to make some drug available for use in that way. So I think that's the second part of the question. The first part is fair enough. I mean, people complain that there aren't enough psychiatric evaluations. People who are in favor of medical aid in dying say that will raise the expense and also create delay in aid in dying. I'm not that persuaded by those things. I will caution, though, that the existence of clinical depression doesn't preclude a finding of capacity to make a particular decision about ending your life. There could be a kind of clinical depression that would be sufficiently severe that if you treated it, you might expect to change the person's choice. But that need not necessarily be true. There could be people who are clinically depressed who their treating physicians judge have the capacity to make a choice about assisted suicide. Indeed, the fact that they're clinically depressed could be part of a rational reason for wanting assisted suicide. And the way the state laws are set up, it's the treating physicians, usually two of them, who have to agree that the patient has capacity to make the choice about aid in dying. And they're supposed to make a psychiatric referral if they think a treatable depression would change that. Is that happening enough? That's a good question.
I think that just reminds me of one of the anecdotal stories in the Australian report I was reading on the way up about the situation in Oregon, and this was with a hospital physician who had referred a man in his 60s to an oncologist in the hospital for treatment of his cancer, and the guy was very keen on hiking, and the treatment reduced his ability to go hiking, and so it's not surprising perhaps that he began to find his quality of life dropping off. And he casually mentioned that he'd been feeling a bit low to the oncologist, whereupon the oncologist wrote to the original referring physician saying, I think he should be offered assisted dying. Will you second the referral? And this was, the consultant had known him a lot longer, and he said, no, I'm not going to agree to it. I don't think this is right. And without any psychiatric assessment, the oncologist then referred to a willing doctor, and the guy had no contact with the psychiatrist and was given a lethal prescription, which he took. So I think trying to dissociate, even with your sort of terminal diagnosis, knowing that we're the psychosomatic unity, is very, very difficult, very, very difficult. And your assurance that, on balance, it's probably doing more good than harm. I just don't know. I just don't know. How can we know?
Okay, I'm afraid we've got a last question. Shona, make it as brief as possible.
Thank you very much for this evening. Really enjoyed it. As
comment about that it's not, the law isn't about suffering, it's about terminal illness, and since we've got lawmakers in the room, I find that, is that explicitly written into the law that it's not, that suffering has no bearing on this? And also, another question, really briefly, is a more provocative question, is that the public are more inclined to have medically assisted dying, but doctors are more inclined to support assisted dying when the patient has to take medication. Is that a bit of a cop-out, or is there, what's the ethical reasons behind that? That's a bit provocative as a last question.
I think it's definitely a cop-out. And even with the BMA sort of wavering and being undecided about it, only a small minority, a sizable minority, it's about 30% of doctors said they'd be prepared to do it. But it reminds me of when I was just pre-pandemic at a teaching session where a palliative care consultant in front of 200 or so young medical students just entering in Australia was giving a talk about the administration of assisted dying there, which in some states is very blurred between euthanasia and the sort of thing that Stephen has been approving. And she said to this group of 20-year-olds, how many of you are in favour of assisted dying? And a forest of hands shot up. I would think probably only 10 or 11 remained down. She gave the talk, she explained how it was done. She then said at the end, how many of you would be prepared to do it? 2 hands went up. So sometimes what one theoretically thinks would be good for other people to do, when it comes to the crunch, if you have to administer it, you may think twice, and I would think with good reason too.
I'm not persuaded by that argument at all. I myself would make a terrible soldier, but I'm glad they exist. And the fact that I would be reluctant to serve as one might be as much a problem with me as anything else. I'm not persuaded by that argument. I just did want to answer the first question. All of the jurisdictions in the US that permit assisted suicide say you must have a terminal diagnosis from your physician, and then you need to ask for access to assisted suicide at least 2 times, at least 14 days apart. So there's a sort of persistent desire, repeated requests for suicide. Your 2 physicians need to say that you have capacity to make that decision, and then they write you the prescription, and you have to retain capacity to the time where you take it, and you must take it on your own. All of the jurisdictions have those features. Many of them have other things too, but those are the core characteristics of the US regime.
Okay, I want to apologise for those who have had your hand up. I apologise if I haven't got to your question. But on your behalf, I want to thank Trevor and Stephen for coming tonight, for dialoguing, I think, in a very constructive way, and answering our questions. As probably most of you know, we are likely, or very likely, to have legislation coming before the Scottish Parliament sometime next year. Liam MacArthur has got the number of MSPs required to bring forward a proposal, and he and his team are drafting a bill at the moment, which will likely come the first part of next year, and will then go through its parliamentary procedure. For those of you who are Scottish, then please, if you have a strong view on this, on either way, then please do contact your MSP, both your constituency MSP and your regional MSPs, and if you don't know who they are, you can get that information on the Scottish website. And I hope the debate that we have in the Parliament next year is as grown up as we've had here tonight.
Good point about the soldier.
So I'm going to say thank you, and I'm just going to hand back to our boss, who's going to say a few final words.
Thank you to all our speakers. Can we give them a thank you? as I was chatting with someone doing a little self-promotion among friends, I said, even if you're not interested in the topic, at least come and see civil dialogue on a controversial topic. And I think we achieved that today, so thank you so much for not making me a liar. Trinity Forum Europe hosts a variety of events throughout the year, as well as weekly scriptoria in Edinburgh, St Andrews, Oxford, and Cambridge. The scriptoria are designed to support postgraduate students in their research by offering structured reading and writing days weekly in the context of community. If you are interested in these, please have a chat with me after, or you can email me at edinburghtrinityforum@gmail.com. Or if you did not click the little tick to keep updated on events when you registered through Eventbrite, you can also send me an email there. We have a series of events that are being finalized for next term. Topics include forming friendships across ideological lines, basically being friends with the enemy. I'm really excited. We'll bring in a popular YouTuber into that. I'll leave him unnamed until it's finalized, but he does a lot of dialogue in kind of the faith and philosophy of religion realm. We will also do an event on the place of hope in the climate change conversation, among many others. So I do hope to see you not just tonight at the wine reception directly after this, but at future events as well. I do see we have some St. Andrews representatives in the room as well, so if you have any connections to St. Andrews, we have Trinity Forum events there as well. So thank you once again for coming. Wine will be served in the balcony room. So thank you.
My best friend at grammar school went to join the army and became a soldier.
Sorry, I may have to listen to that.